Good afternoon. This is the Monday, November 16th, 2015 meeting of the Ordinance Committee. Ms. Wong, would you call the roll, please?
Yes. Councilmember Rouse?
Here.
Councilmember Hotchkiss? Here. And Councilmember Murillo?
Here.
Thank you. And we'll allow 2 minutes of public comment for any item that's not on the agenda. And I see no public. We'll move right into the item. Mr. Cronman, please.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the Ordinance Committee. My name is Mick Cronman, Harbor Operations Manager. I'm joined today by Waterfront Director Scott Reedman and Assistant City Attorney Sarah Connect and City Attorney R.L. Colon to discuss with you a proposed ordinance regarding the definition of vessel. But before we do that, I have a couple of preliminary notes. One of them is I'd like to think of as simple housekeeping. And with my apologies, if you look on the very last page of the proposed ordinance, page 6, there's a typographical error in the very last sentence of the last page. It says no length or beam variations after December 1, 2015. It should be no length or beam variations, B-E-A-M. We'll make that correction before a full council review. And the other notion I wanted to discuss with you is actually more substantive. And what I wanted to do is make something very clear from the beginning so there wasn't confusion in any of the council members' minds moving forward through this report. And that is to note that this proposal to define vessel as it does in the ordinance before you has no effect or relationship to the department's liveaboard program. The department has a liveaboard program where individual slip permittees, 10% of our 113 permittees, can apply for and be allotted a slip permit. This is a number that was agreed to jointly with the State Lands Commission several years ago. Currently, we have 98 permits assigned. We have 15 available. The proposal you're going to hear today is about functionality. It's about design, construction, and functionality and the capability of going to sea. It really has nothing to do, and it's understandable that people would get it confused, but I wanted to make it clear that it has nothing to do with our liveaboard ordinance and our liveaboard policies. Folks could walk up today and get a liveaboard permit. In fact, we have liveaboards that range from small vessels like this one to larger ones like this. But again, the concluding part of this is what we're going to talk about today doesn't have anything to do with living aboard your vessel. So by way of background to the proposal before you, interest in having floating homes has existed for decades around Santa Barbara Harbor. Not homes to reside in necessarily, but homes that aren't designed, or constructed or capable of ocean travel. I think if you think, Sleepless in Seattle or Sausalito or some of the very lovely sometimes, but box-shaped residences are what people have expressed interest in. We still get routine calls about those kinds of craft, whether or not they're allowed in Santa Barbara Harbor. And what we've been leaning on is our operability ordinance. Our operability ordinance, which in fact was preceded by a navigability ordinance, have all been iterative efforts to try and discourage that kind of berthing, docking, or berthing, anchoring, or mooring in the harbor district of those kinds of craft. Currently, we rely most heavily on our operability ordinance, and the definition it's also included in the ordinance as not being changed, but it's included in the definition section of Title 17, says that a vessel's ability to maneuver safely, this is the definition, under its own power from any place in the harbor district to the open waters of the Pacific Ocean and back to its point of origin. And of course, there's a section in Title 17 that requires all boats to be operable to meet this definition. Well, the problem is that folks out there in the harbor have developed workarounds for the operability ordinance, despite our best efforts to keep the loopholes as small as we can. And with a lot of work and creativity, they use outboard engines, makeshift helms, temporary lookout stations that persist. These persist solely to pass operability tests. Once the operability test is complete, these floating boxes, these floating homes, if you will, go back to their slip. It's not that they don't go to sea, they don't have the capability, really, to go to sea. They pass this modest operability test and they go back to where they were and they stay there. So what this has resulted in for these craft and for the city is this is a one-time ceremonial exercise. And to be honest with you, it's embarrassing to us because the city is the one that is responsible for drafting and enforcing this ordinance. And when people utilize these workarounds, that we have no way to say, you know what, it's not operable because they've really met the operability ordinance, then we're left with, still a problematic situation relative to finding tools to prevent those kinds of birthings. So we currently don't have those tools. What we're trying to do with the proposed ordinance before you is to be proactive and once again try and get ahead of this. As I said, it's been iterative. We tried it with navigability. That ordinance is gone. We've tried it with operability, which is going to remain. So the proposed definition of vessel, we're hoping, will help make a large step toward solving this problem or limiting the ability of folks to birth those kinds of craft. So examples of jury-rigged floating homes used to pass the navigability or operability standards range from small ones to large ones. These two are two of four that exist in Santa Barbara Harbor now. We've surveyed the whole harbor, and these are really the only four that jump out at us as not really meeting the intent of what we're proposing to you today. But as you'll see, they would be, we don't use the word grandfathered, but functionally they'd be grandfathered in and allowed to stay where they are. So there are policies that support where we're headed with this proposed ordinance, and they range from the Coastal Act, which supports priority protections for recreational boating and commercial fishing in the harbor, and the Harbor Master Plan that defines a working harbor as one that exercises priority for commercial fishing and recreational boating. And then there's always the department's slip waiting list and our waiting list policies. We currently have 28 individuals who've been waiting on the slip waiting list, some of them for decades, really lingering on that list, paying their $40 a year to stay on the list, in hopes of simply going boating, recreational boating out of Santa Barbara Harbor. And we believe that keeping the door open for the floating edifices, if you will, that you saw pictures of and I described, only creates to discourage or limit our ability to accommodate the public through the slip waiting list. So the definition of vessel, this first came to our attention and became sort of planted a seed for us after a 2013 Supreme Court maritime case. It was the first maritime case the High Court had heard in many years, and it involved a conflict down in Florida, a barge and federal law and state law and what have you, and it percolated all the way to the Supreme Court. And in its decision in articulating the majority opinion in that case, Justice Brewer said, and this is a quote from the opinion, "A floating residence is not a vessel unless a reasonable observer looking to the home's physical characteristics and activities would consider it to be designed for carrying people or things over water." This is very much akin to what we've borrowed for our ordinance that's before you today. So the court's ruling provided that guidance for us, and we've been working on a definition of vessel ever since. So as I mentioned, currently we have four floating homes in the Harbor District that don't meet the proposed definition of vessel. And again, and I'm repeating what I said in the preamble, if you will, this would have no effect on our liveaboard program. But instead, if it was effective as of December 1st, which is articulated in the ordinance, anybody who's in the harbor that doesn't meet this definition would be allowed to stay with two caveats that are in the ordinance. Number one, to a benefit to them, they wouldn't have to undergo the operability test that we require of any vessel during a slip permit transaction or any vessel that comes to our mind or our attention that is not operable. And on the other hand, though, they would not be able to increase their their width, or their length at once this ordinance is in place. In other words, if you have a grandfathered, if you will, floating home, it can't grow. It is what it is, and it's locked in from December 1st on, or whenever this ordinance passes, is adopted, or whichever is later. So the Harbor Commission reviewed the proposed ordinance in 2013, 2014, and 2015. We also published an article about it in Dock Lines. I also met with the owners of floating homes that would not meet the definition of vessel. All of them supported the proposed ordinance, and one of them even wrote a letter to the Harbor Commission reiterating that. And it was in 2015, our last meeting in 2015, that the Harbor Commission recommended that we forward this to you to review and recommended council approval. So in conclusion, Mr. Chair, with adoption of this proposed ordinance, we believe the city will have the legal means to deny berthing, mooring, or anchoring in the Harbor District for man-made floating objects that don't meet the definition of vessel. And this would prevent proliferation of floating homes in Santa Barbara Harbor, where the city's priority obligations are to accommodate recreational boating and commercial fishing. And that concludes my report. I'd be happy to answer any questions, but before I do, I believe Ms. Connect has a few comments.
Thank you, Mr. Crawman. Mr. Chairman, members of the Ordinance Committee, I just wanted to make a couple of comments here that follow along with Mr. Crawman's presentation, and that has to do with the legal basis for enacting this ordinance, which provides a definition of vessel and would prohibit non-vessels or would prohibit these man-made floating objects from berthing, mooring, or anchoring in the Harbor District. And as you know, the Harbor District would encompass the whole of what's defined as the Harbor District. And, you know, Mr. Crawman could give you those parameters, but it's not just the harbor per se, but it's also it's the whole Harbor District. So it would include the anchorage and the wharf and the whole area. So as Mr. Crawman said, the United States Supreme Court gave us the definition of vessel back in 2013, and what that definition did is it recognized that not all man-made floating objects, as we like to call them, are vessels. And so that led us to the question, then, can we then regulate non-vessels or man-made floating objects in the Harbor District? So in order to answer that question, one of the first questions is regulation of those man-made floating objects or those non-vessels preempted by federal or state law? Because if it is, the city can't regulate in that area. So in order to answer that question, you have to then understand what preemption means. And that's kind of a complicated question, but essentially when it comes to federal law, you have to look, and first you have to determine, is there federal legislation out there that occupies the entire field? Meaning, is there's basically no room left for any local or state legislation? There's such pervasive federal legislation on that particular field that no state could even regulate in a tiny corner of it. Second, would your local legislation directly conflict with the federal statute? If there is no local legislations permitted. Finally, is it clear that the federal legislature intended to preempt local legislation due to some statutory scheme because they felt that there needed to be consistent federal legislation? And, when it comes to maritime laws, when it comes to navigability, when it comes to safety, environmental laws, that's often the case. And there are extensive federal legislation when it comes to navigation, when it comes to safety, when it comes to environmental laws having to do with the use of the waters of the United States. So there is lots of legislation out there dealing with vessels. So this was a big question that we needed to answer. That's a lot of the reason why it took us from 2013 until 2015 to get here today before you with this. But at the end of the day, we could not find any legislation out there that dealt with man-made floating objects. So, while there is lots of legislation dealing with every type of vessels, navigation, safety, tugboats, whatever. There is no that we could find legislation dealing with man-made floating objects or that would preclude the city from regulating man-made floating objects and from prohibiting them from the Harbor District. So we think, at least for now, we're on pretty solid ground to regulate them within the harbor district.
Thank you. Any questions from the committee? Ms. Murillo.
Okay, so there's 4 that will remain, and then you say there's others that you've talked to. How many are those?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Murillo, I spoke. To identify ones we thought might not meet the parameters of this definition. I had Harbor Patrol survey the entire harbor with the definition in hand, and they found 4 that they were clearly wouldn't. I think I showed you pictures of 2. You will see at the harbor there are little structures, house-like structures on some liveaboard vessels and what have you. But if you look closely, they're actually built on hulls that were designed and constructed for the purpose of carrying people or things over water. So they're not even included. But the real takeaway here relative to the ordinance is anything that's out there that we'd have spotted or not spotted as of December 1st or the adoption of the ordinance will be covered, if you will, or protected by this ordinance. Does that make sense? Grandfathered, and I hesitate to use the word, but grandfathered in their current status.
Because it's patriarchal, or why wouldn't you use that expression?
It's because it's not a legal term we use.
Well, but I wanted to ask about that too. Why not get rid of those 4, since they violate the Coastal Act and accessibility and boatability? They're protected by some legal.
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Murillo, they've passed the operability test. They've passed all aspects. They've passed all legal and regulatory requirements we had at the time when they transferred into or were assigned their slips. So we didn't deem it would be appropriate or fair to throw them out of their slips, terminate their slips.
So it's not an annual operability test. It's just a one-time, and they got in.
Yes, it's a condition of slip permit assignment.
Okay.
And liveaboard assignment.
Thank you. And forgive me for not knowing more about
that's okay.
your department. Thank you.
Mr. Hotchkiss.
Thank you. So you talked to the owners of all 4 of the vessels in question?
Yes.
Not vessels, sorry. And what was their response? Are they okay with being grandfathered in? And they understand that the operability requirement is now null and void for them?
That's correct on both fronts. Yeah, I spoke with each of them. I visited their homes, and we sat down and talked, and I explained to them what the nature of the proposed ordinance was.
Right.
And all of them were forgive the expression, on board with it.
Okay, well said. All right, well, I'd like to move that we pass this unanimously. Thank you very much.
Second.
Okay, moved in second. I did have a couple of questions, though, for you, Mr. Cron, before we move on. There have been questions in the past about things like pontoon boats, or boats that are usually made for lakes and in-water inlets. So they're clearly not an ocean-going vessel, but for this definition, they wouldn't be singled out. Is that correct?
That's correct, Mr. Chair. They would meet this definition. Your typical pontoon boat, your Lake Havasu, Lake Powell boat would meet the requirements of this definition.
And clearly, as I'm a harbor user as well, there are multitudes of vessels, and I get a lot of comments about this that are, as you say, there's a hole underneath there somewhere. But on top of that is basically a condo, and they're turned over as such, violating actually the spirit of what we're trying to do in the harbor. But legally, we have no grounds to either regulate or to move those on, or I'm sure that's something you've thought about, but...
Mr. Chair, indeed, we do have those, and indeed, we've thought about it. And as long as they're able to pass the operability test and meet the parameters of the requirements of this ordinance, they're going to be there. And with any hope, slowly by attrition, they'll go by the by.
All right, very well. Well, we have a motion and a second. All those in favor?
Aye.
You pass unanimously. Thank you. And there's no further business on the agenda, is there?
Adjourned.
We're adjourned.